The Hallbrook Grand Hotel stood in the center of downtown like a monolith of glass and polished stone, its 30 floors glowing against the dark ink of the evening sky. A red carpet, thick and unnervingly soft, stretched from the entrance to the curb where a parade of sleek black sedans dropped off the city's elite. Men in tailored navy suits and women in shimmering gowns that cost more than a mid-sized car adjusted their jewelry before stepping into the golden warmth of the lobby. Everything about the atmosphere whispered the same intimidating message. This is where powerful people gather. I sat in the passenger seat of our car for a moment longer than necessary, my fingers nervously twisting the small silver bracelet on my wrist, the one my sister had given me 3 Christmases ago. It was a modest piece of jewelry, much like my dress. I had chosen a simple dark blue knee-length silk gown. It was elegant in an understated way, the kind of outfit that usually made me feel confident, but tonight, standing on the edge of this extravagant world, it felt like a costume that didn't quite fit. Thomas had already stepped out. He stood by the driver's side door, smoothing the sleeves of his new charcoal suit. The fabric caught the streetlights, sharp and flawless. He looked like the king of the world, a man who had spent 40 years building an empire from nothing. He leaned down toward the open window, his expression etched with a familiar, cold impatience. "Maria," he said, his voice low and clipped. "Come on. We are already 10 minutes behind. The board members are waiting." I nodded quickly and stepped out into the biting evening air. As we walked toward the entrance, Thomas didn't slow his pace to match mine. He didn't offer his arm. He marched toward the red carpet with the singular focus of a man who had already forgotten I was behind him. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of marble and light. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting dancing shadows across the Harrington Global Annual Investor Gala banner that stretched across the ballroom entrance. Tonight was supposed to be about us. It was our 40th wedding anniversary. Thomas had insisted on merging our anniversary celebration with his company's biggest networking event of the year. Efficiency, Maria, he had told me weeks ago. Why celebrate in private when we can show the world the strength of the Vance legacy? A woman at the registration table handed us our name tags. Thomas clipped his badge to his jacket with a practiced smile. Then he handed mine to me. It was a small white card that read, "Maria Vance. Guest." Just the word guest. No title. No mention of the fact that I had been the one to manage the books for the first 10 years of his startup. No mention that I was the co-founder of the life he currently enjoyed. I slipped it onto my dress quietly, feeling a strange chill run through my chest. As we entered the ballroom, the sheer scale of the opulence took my breath away. Round tables covered in ivory linen filled the space, and waiters moved gracefully through the crowd carrying silver trays of vintage champagne. A jazz band played a slow, elegant melody near the stage, but the music was nearly drowned out by the roar of expensive laughter and the clinking of crystal. Groups of executives stood in tight circles, discussing market shares and acquisitions. Thomas's eyes began to scan the room, calculating, measuring, and networking before we had even reached the center of the floor. He exhaled slowly, a look of pure satisfaction crossing his face. "This is perfect," he murmured. I glanced at him, trying to find a trace of the man I had married 4 decades ago. "It's very grand, Thomas. I just wish we could have had one dance before the networking began." He didn't look at me. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on my shoulder and leaned closer, though his eyes remained fixed on a group of investors near the bar. "Listen," he said, his tone dropping into a whisper that made my stomach tighten. "Just stay near the bar tonight, okay? I don't want things to get awkward." I blinked, the noise of the room suddenly feeling very far away. "Stay near the bar? Thomas, it's our anniversary. People will want to congratulate us." He hesitated, his confident expression cracking just enough to reveal a sliver of something sharp and ugly. "Look, Maria, these events are different now. People talk. They ask questions about tech, about global scaling, about things you haven't kept up with. I just don't want you to feel out of place. You're a freelance programmer, a hobbyist at best these days. These are CEOs." The word stung more than a physical blow. Out of place. He was worried that his wife, the woman who had sacrificed her own career to raise their daughter, while he worked 20-hour days, would embarrass him in front of his important friends. Before I could find my voice to respond, a man in a gray suit called out from across the room. Thomas. There he is. The man of the hour. Thomas's entire posture changed instantly. His shoulders straightened, his professional smile returned, and he looked every bit the visionary leader the magazines claimed him to be. Excuse me, he said to me, not looking back. That's the head of the strategy team. Remember, stay near the bar. I'll come get you for the toast later. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there alone for a moment, watching him cross the marble floor. I watched him shake hands with the man in the gray suit, laughing and talking with an ease that he never showed at home. I turned slowly toward the bar, my heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, feeling like a piece of decorative furniture that had been moved out of the way for a more important guest. The bartender gave me a polite, pitying smile. What can I get you, ma'am? Sparkling water, please, I said, my voice sounding small in my own ears. As I sipped the water, I watched the room. In the middle of it all stood Thomas. He was now surrounded by a small group, 3 men and a woman. The woman caught my attention immediately. She was tall, perhaps in her late 50s, wearing a red gown that shimmered like fire under the chandeliers. She laughed at something Thomas said and then, with a familiarity that made my heart stop, she placed her hand lightly on his arm. Thomas didn't move it away. In fact, he leaned in closer to her as she whispered something in his ear. I recognized her. Her name was Vanessa. She was the marketing director Thomas had hired 3 years ago. He had spoken of her often, her visionary campaigns, her relentless work ethic. I had met her twice at company dinners, and both times she had been perfectly charming. Yet she had looked at me as if I were a ghost. A man in the group asked a question. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Thomas's reaction clearly. He smiled, shook his head, and I read the words on his lips as if they were written in fire. Asterisk, my wife couldn't make it tonight. Asterisk. The glass of sparkling water nearly slipped from my hand. I was standing only 20 feet away. My husband had just told a circle of the city's most powerful people that I didn't exist. He wasn't just hiding me near the bar. He was erasing me. I looked down at the white badge pinned to my chest. Asterisk Maria Vance. Guest, asterisk. The room felt suddenly claustrophobically warm. I needed air. I needed to know that I was still real. Without thinking, I slipped away from the bar and headed toward the balcony doors at the side of the ballroom. No one stopped me. No one noticed. Within seconds, the soft jazz and the roar of the investors faded into a distant hum as I stepped out into the cold, silent night. I leaned against the railing, staring at the sea of city lights below. I had spent 40 years building a life with a man I realized I didn't know at all. I thought tonight was a celebration of a journey. I didn't realize it was the end of the road. But as I stood there, shivering in the breeze, the balcony door slid open again. I didn't turn around, expecting it to be another guest seeking a cigarette break. It's a long fall from grace, isn't it, Maria? I froze. That wasn't Thomas's voice. It was a woman's. Vanessa's. I turned slowly. She stood there, silhouetted against the golden light of the ballroom, looking at me not with pity, but with a cold, triumphant hunger. He told them I wasn't here, I said, my voice trembling. Vanessa stepped closer, the heels of her designer shoes clicking on the concrete. He told them the truth, Maria. In this world, if you aren't an asset, you're a liability. And Thomas has finally decided to liquidate his liabilities. She smiled then, a jagged, cruel thing. Don't look so shocked. The papers are already signed. The celebration tonight? It isn't for an anniversary. It's for a debut. Thomas's new life, and his real family. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. His real family? What are you talking about? Vanessa reached into her clutch and pulled out a small, framed digital photo. She turned it toward me. It was a picture of Thomas, Vanessa, and a young man in his 30s who looked exactly like a younger version of my husband. Meet Jason, she whispered. Thomas. He's 30 years old, Maria. He's the future of Vance Global. And tomorrow, everything you think you own will belong to him. The world didn't just crack. It shattered. 40 years of memories, of sacrifices, of love. All of it was a lie built on a foundation of betrayal. I looked past her into the ballroom, where Thomas was now taking the stage, a microphone in his hand, preparing to deliver the toast that would end my life as I knew it. The cold air on the balcony felt like needles against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the ice forming in my veins. Vanessa stood there, her red gown mocking me with its vibrancy, while the digital image of Jason stared back at me. 30 years. Thomas had been living a double life for 3/4 of our marriage. Every holiday, every business trip, every late night at the office flashed before my eyes, redefined by this crushing revelation. "You're lying," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. Thomas wouldn't, he couldn't. Vanessa let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Thomas is a man of logic, Maria. He spent 40 years with a guest, when he could have been with a partner. He stayed for the image, for the stability you provided while he built his kingdom. But the kingdom is finished now, and it needs an heir worthy of the Vance name. Not a daughter who wastes her life painting, but a son who understands the language of power." She tucked the photo back into her clutch, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying triumph. "Go ahead. Go back inside. Listen to his speech. It's the most honest thing he's said to you in decades." I pushed past her, my movements mechanical. I felt like I was watching myself from a great distance, a ghost drifting through a sea of golden light and expensive perfume. As I stepped back into the ballroom, the jazz band had stopped playing. A single spotlight focused on the small stage near the center of the room. Thomas stood behind the microphone. He looked magnificent, the epitome of success. He waited for the room to settle, for the last few whispers of the investors to die down. When he spoke, his voice was rich, commanding, and utterly devoid of the warmth I had once mistaken for love. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and partners," Thomas began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Tonight marks a significant milestone. 40 years ago, I started a journey. Many of you believe tonight is a celebration of a marriage, a tribute to the past." He paused, and for a fleeting second, his eyes found mine near the back of the room. There was no apology in them, only a cold, clinical finality. "But the past is a stagnant pool," he continued, his voice hardening. "To thrive, a company and a man must evolve. Tonight, Harrington Global isn't just celebrating 40 years of history. We are announcing 40 years of progress. And progress requires making difficult choices. It requires cutting away the old to make room for the new." A ripple of confused murmurs moved through the crowd. I felt my knees trembling. I reached out to steady myself against a nearby table, my fingers digging into the white linen. "I have spent my life building an empire," Thomas said, his posture straightening. "And tonight, I am finally bringing that empire home. I am filing for divorce from Maria Vance, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I saw the faces of our friends, the investors we had dined with, the executives I had helped him recruit. Some looked shocked. Others simply looked away, already calculating how this would affect their shares. "But this is not a moment of loss," Thomas shouted over the rising whispers. "It is a moment of expansion. I would like to introduce the woman who has been my true strategist for the last decade, and the man who will lead Vance Global into the next generation. Please welcome Vanessa Cole and my son Jason Vance." Vanessa appeared from the side of the stage, her red dress flowing like a river of blood. Beside her stood the young man from the photo. Jason moved with Thomas's exact gait, possessing the same arrogant tilt of the head. He didn't look like a secret. He looked like an inevitability. The room erupted into a chaos of applause and hushed gossip. Thomas reached out and grasped Jason's shoulder, a gesture of public claiming that he had never once shown our daughter. "Jason is a visionary," Thomas told the microphone, his voice booming with a pride I had never heard before. "He has developed a new AI infrastructure that will revolutionize how we handle global-scale optimization. To ensure its success, I have transferred all personal and joint assets, our properties, our primary accounts, and the controlling shares of this company, to a trust managed by me, which will fund the launch of Jason's new enterprise, Apex Neural." He looked directly at me then, no longer hiding me, but exposing me to the full weight of my humiliation. "Maria has been a dedicated guest in my life," he said, the word guest dripping with a cruelty that made the crowd gasp. But her role has concluded. She will be provided with a modest settlement, as per the documents she signed during our estate planning session last month. I trust she will vacate the primary residence by tomorrow morning. I felt the air leave my lungs. The estate planning session. He had brought home a stack of papers weeks ago, telling me they were standard insurance updates to protect Emily's inheritance. I had trusted him. I had signed them without reading the fine print, my hand guided by 40 years of faith in a man who had been plotting my ruin for 30. I was 65 years old. I was the co-creator of every cent he owned. And in the span of a 3-minute toast, I had been stripped of my name, my home, and my dignity. Laughter began to bubble up around the stage as Jason stepped to the mic to thank his father. They looked like a dynasty. I looked like a mistake. The room began to spin. The crystal chandeliers became blurred streaks of light. The smell of the lilies on the tables became sickeningly sweet, like the scent of a funeral. I felt the eyes of the high society women on me. Eyes full of pity, of judgment, of the terrifying realization that if it could happen to Maria Vance, it could happen to any of them. I turned to run, to find a way out of this gilded nightmare, but my legs felt like lead. Just as I thought I would collapse onto the marble floor, a firm hand gripped my elbow. "Don't you dare fall, Mom." I turned, my vision blurry with unshed tears. It was Emily, my daughter. She wasn't wearing a gown. She was in a sharp black blazer and trousers, her hair pulled back in a tight professional knot. Her face wasn't etched with the shock I felt. Instead, her eyes were burning with a fierce, cold intelligence. "He took everything, Emily," I choked out. "He has a son. He has a son who's 30. Emily didn't flinch. She pulled me closer, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. "I know. I've known for a while that he was hiding something big. But he made a mistake tonight." She looked toward the stage, where Thomas was laughing with Vanessa and Jason, the three of them surrounded by investors like a new royal family. "He thinks he's the only one in this family who knows how to code," Emily whispered, her grip on my arm tightening. "He thinks because you stayed home, you forgot everything you taught me. But he forgot one thing. I'm a freelance programmer for a reason. I don't just build apps, Mom. I track data. And I've been recording every word of that toast on a secured server." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a level that only I could hear. "He thinks those papers you signed are the end. But those papers were processed through an old server at his firm, one I've had a backdoor into for months. We aren't going to cry, and we aren't going to hide. We're going to call Martin. And then, we're going to show Thomas what happens when you try to delete a woman who knows the source code of your entire life." For the first time that night, the crushing weight on my chest lifted, replaced by a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope. It was a cold, calculated rage. I looked at the man on the stage, the man I had loved for 40 years, and I realized he hadn't just declared war on a wife. He had declared war on a partner. And the partner was finally waking up. The elevator doors of the Hallbrook Grand Hotel closed with a soft, expensive hiss, finally cutting off the roar of the gala and the suffocating scent of lilies. For a moment, we stood in the silence of the descending car. Maria, the woman who had just been publicly discarded after 40 years, and Emily, the daughter who had become her mother's sudden shield. Maria leaned her forehead against the cool mirrored wall, her simple blue dress reflecting a version of herself she no longer recognized. Her breathing was shallow, a frantic rhythm of a heart trying to survive a landslide. Emily didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell her mother it would be okay, because they both knew it wasn't. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small tablet. Her fingers danced across the glass, her expression identical to the one Maria used to wear when she was the primary architect of Thomas's first database 3 decades ago. "I need you to breathe, Mom," Emily said, her voice a low melodic command. "He wanted you to collapse in that room. He wanted the narrative to be that you were a fragile, aging guest who couldn't handle the pace of his new world. If you break, he wins the public relations battle before the legal one even begins." Maria lifted her head, her silver hair slightly disheveled but her eyes beginning to clear. "He has a son, Emily. Jason. He's 30 years old. That means Thomas was living a double life since before you were born. Every dinner, every vacation, he was already gone." Emily's jaw tightened. And he thinks he can fund that son's future with your blood and sweat. He thinks he was clever with those estate planning papers he made you sign. He thinks he's liquidated you. She tapped a final key on her tablet. But he forgot that he's not the only one who understands how to hide things in plain sight. The elevator reached the lobby. Emily led Maria past the marble columns and the gleaming chandeliers, ignoring the curious glances of the hotel staff who had likely already heard whispers of the scandal upstairs. They didn't go to the main entrance where the sleek black sedans were waiting. Instead, Emily directed them toward a side exit where a modest car was parked, a stark contrast to the luxury they had arrived in. Inside the car, the reality of the cold night air seemed to sharpen Maria's resolve. The shock was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but beneath it, the freelance programmer she used to be was starting to calculate. He said the primary residence is his now, that I have to vacate by morning. Let him think that, Emily replied, putting the car into gear. We aren't going back to the estate. We're going to my apartment. I've already moved a few of your essentials there over the last week. I had a feeling this night would end in fire. Maria looked at her daughter in surprise. You knew. I didn't know about Jason, Emily admitted, her eyes fixed on the road. But I track data for a living, Mom. I saw the irregularities in the company's offshore servers. I saw the transfers to a shell company called Apex Neural. Thomas thinks he's a tech visionary, but he's just a man who uses outdated encryption because he's too arrogant to believe anyone would dare look into his private business. They arrived at Emily's apartment, a small, orderly space filled with the hum of high-end servers and the scent of strong coffee. It was the nerve center of a woman who had mastered the art of being invisible while remaining powerful. Maria sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching a mug of tea Emily had pressed into her hands. The silence of the apartment felt like a sanctuary after the public execution at the Hallbrook. I feel so foolish, Maria whispered. 40 years and I didn't see the man standing right next to me. He spent 30 years perfecting the lie, Mom, Emily said, pulling a second chair to the desk where 3 monitors were already glowing with lines of complex code. Arrogance is his greatest strength, but it will be his undoing. He treated you like a guest tonight because he truly believes you are powerless. He thinks those papers you signed are an airtight seal on your life. She turned one of the monitors toward Maria. On the screen was a digital copy of the authorization Maria had signed weeks ago. Look at the timestamp on the digital signature, Mom. And look at the biometric metadata. Maria leaned closer, her eyes scanning the data. As an old-school coder, she understood the language of logic. There is no biometric pulse rhythm recorded, just a standard encrypted hash. Exactly, Emily said, a ghost of a smile appearing on her face. Thomas used the Harrington Global Legacy server to process these. He didn't want to use the new multi-factor system because he knew I had oversight there. He used a loophole, an old server that hasn't been patched in 3 years. He thought it was a safe place to commit matrimonial fraud. Maria's breath caught. Fraud. If I can prove I didn't provide full informed consent, or that the signature was obtained under false pretenses. It's better than that, Emily interrupted. Tonight, on that stage, Thomas provided the ultimate evidence of intent. He publicly declared Jason as his son and heir. He admitted to the transfer of joint assets to fund a son who has no legal claim to our family's marital estate. He didn't just break your heart, Mom. He gave us a confession on a silver platter. Emily picked up her phone and dialed a number. It's time to call Martin. Martin Reynolds had been the family's lawyer and a close friend of Maria's since the early days of the startup. When he arrived at the apartment an hour later, he didn't look like a man who had been woken up in the middle of the night. He looked like a soldier reporting for duty. He listened in grim silence as Emily played back the recording of Thomas's toast. He called her a guest? Martin asked, his voice trembling with a rare, cold fury. In front of the entire investment board? He did, Maria said, her voice now steady and clear. And he told me to stand by the bar so I wouldn't make things awkward. Martin set his briefcase on the table and opened it, revealing a stack of documents. Thomas Vance is many things, but tonight he was a fool. Matrimonial law in this state is very clear about the commingling of assets and the duty of transparency. By revealing a 30-year secret and a separate family, he has opened the door for a total audit of every cent he's touched since 1996. He looked at Maria, his expression softening with genuine respect. You weren't just a wife, Maria. You were the one who balanced the books when this company was nothing but a dream in a garage. You are a co-founder. And if Thomas thinks he can move the Vance legacy to a via hay for his mistress and her son, he has forgotten who actually built the walls of this empire. Maria stood up, smoothed down the blue silk of her dress, and walked toward the window. The city skyline was still bright, a maze of lights and secrets. For 40 years, she had been the foundation, the silent support, the woman who stayed near the bar so her husband could shine. He wants me out of the house by morning, Maria said, turning back to Emily and Martin. But I think it's time Thomas learned that when you try to delete the source code of your life, the whole system crashes. Emily's fingers began flying across her keyboard again. I'm initiating a digital audit of the Harrington Global Legacy server now. If he's moved our savings into Apex Neural, I'll find the path. We won't just vacating the house, Mom. We're going to seize the kingdom. The war had begun, and for the first time in 30 years, the odds were no longer in Thomas Vance's favor. He was celebrating a debut, but Maria and Emily were preparing for a shutdown. The blue light from Emily's triple monitor setup cast long, sharp shadows across the room, illuminating Maria's face as she leaned in to study the streaming lines of data. The initial shock had hardened into a cold, analytical focus. In this small apartment, surrounded by the hum of high-end cooling fans and the scent of bitter coffee, the woman the world knew as a discarded socialite was reconnecting with her true self. The architect of the logic that had once made Thomas Vance a billionaire. He was always so proud of his Apex Neural project, Maria whispered, her eyes tracking a series of encrypted packet transfers. He told the investors tonight that Jason developed it. But look at the base logic, Emily. Look at the adaptive convergence handling. Emily paused her typing, her fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. She zoomed in on a specific block of code that had been retrieved through her backdoor into the legacy server. It's elegant. Almost too elegant for someone like Jason to have written from scratch. Maria pointed to a hidden signature within the comment structure of the script. It's not just elegant. It's mine. This is an evolution of the neural optimization model I posted anonymously to the developer forums 2 years ago. Thomas didn't just steal our life, Emily. He stole my work and slapped his son's name on it to justify the asset transfer. The realization hit the room like a physical weight. Thomas hadn't just committed matrimonial fraud by forging her signature. He had committed intellectual property theft on a global scale. He needed Jason to look like a genius to the board, so they wouldn't question why millions of dollars were being diverted into a private trust for a newcomer. Martin Reynolds, sitting at the small kitchen table, looked up from his legal pad. If we can prove that the core technology of Apex Neural belongs to you, Maria, we don't just win the divorce. We can invalidate the entire trust. Every dollar he moved out of Harrington Global and into Jason's company was based on a lie. In the eyes of the law, that's not just a breach of fiduciary duty. It's a criminal conspiracy. How long will it take to prove? Maria asked, her voice steady. Ordinarily? Months of litigation, Martin admitted. But Thomas made a massive tactical error tonight. He gave his speech at the Harrington Global Annual Investor Gala. Every word of his confession was spoken to the very board of directors who have a legal obligation to report fraud. He's already provided the intent. Now we just need the paper trail. Emily grinned, a fierce light in her eyes. The paper trail isn't on paper, Martin. It's on the blockchain. Thomas moved the assets through a verified digital ledger thinking it would make the transfer permanent and untraceable. He's a dinosaur who thinks he's a shark. He understands that blockchain is permanent, but he doesn't realize that in a public-private hybrid chain like the one Harrington uses, permanent also means visible to those with the right keys. She tapped a final sequence of keys, and the screen flickered to life with a comprehensive map of every transaction Thomas had authorized in the last 90 days. The map looked like a spiderweb, with Harrington Global at the center and dozens of thin digital threads reaching out to offshore accounts, shell companies, and finally, the Apex Neural Trust. Look at the authorizations. Emily said, highlighting a series of entries. They all used your digital ID, Mom. But the metadata for the pulse rhythm detection is missing. The system flagged it as an irregularity, but Thomas overruled it using his administrative override. He literally forced the fraud through the system. Maria felt a strange sense of calm. He thought I wouldn't know where to look. He thought because I spent the last 20 years focusing on our family and your education, that my mind had gone soft. She looked at her daughter. He forgot who taught him how to think. We have enough for an emergency injunction, Martin said, standing up and reaching for his phone. I'm going to call a judge I know. Someone who values the integrity of the law as much as Thomas Vance disdains it. We'll file for an immediate freeze on all trust accounts and a temporary restraining order barring Thomas or Vanessa from moving a single cent. Maria checked the time on the corner of the monitor. 3:14 a.m. In less than 5 hours, the sun would rise over the Hallbrook Grand Hotel, and the high society world would wake up to the news of the Vance divorce. Thomas would be at the estate, likely with Vanessa, drinking expensive scotch and celebrating his victory. He told me to vacate the house by morning, Maria said. Don't, Emily and Martin said in unison. Let him come to the house, Martin added, his professional mask slipping to reveal a sliver of poetic justice. Let him find you there. Not as a guest, not as a victim, but as the woman who is about to take his entire kingdom back. We'll serve him the papers ourselves. Maria walked over to a small mirror in Emily's hallway. She looked at the woman in the simple blue dress. The simple silver bracelet was still on her wrist. A gift from a sister who had always reminded her of her worth. She smoothed her hair, which was turning silver at the temples, and realized she didn't look like an aging guest. She looked like an owner. I spent 40 years staying in the background because I thought that's what a partner did, Maria said, her reflection speaking back to her with newfound authority. I let him take the credit. I let him build the image. I even let him tell me where to stand at his parties. But Thomas Vance made a fatal mistake tonight. He didn't just break our marriage vows. He tried to delete the foundation of the very company he loves. She turned back to Emily. Can you lock him out of the main Harrington server? Not just the legacy one, but the actual corporate core? Emily looked at her mother with a mix of awe and pride. I can trigger a security audit based on the biometric mismatch I found. It would freeze the entire C-suite's access until a manual verification is performed by the board's security committee. It wouldn't just lock him out. It would sound the alarm to every major shareholder. Do it, Maria commanded. If he wants to play with logic, let's give him a system crash. As Emily's fingers resumed their rhythmic dance across the keys, the first faint light of dawn began to touch the skyline. The anniversary trap was no longer Maria's to fall into. The trap had been reset, and its jaws were aimed directly at the man who thought he had already won. Thomas Vance was about to learn that in the world of high-stakes tech and legal warfare, the person who writes the code is the one who controls the ending. And Maria Vance was just getting started. The first light of dawn was a pale, bruising gray as Maria pulled the car into the long, winding driveway of the Vance estate. For 40 years, this house had been her sanctuary, her project, and the vessel for all her family memories. Now the sprawling limestone mansion looked like a fortress under siege. Thomas's silver luxury sedan was already parked near the front entrance, a silent testament to his arrogance. He truly believed he had already won. Maria stepped out of the car, followed by Emily and Martin. She wasn't wearing the simple blue silk dress from the gala anymore. She had changed into a sharp, charcoal gray suit she hadn't touched in a decade. The one she wore during the final negotiations of Thomas's first major acquisition. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, professional knot. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the night in shock. She looked like a woman reporting for a hostile takeover. Are you ready, Mom? Emily asked, checking her tablet one last time. The screen showed the Harrington Global Internal Network status. It was a sea of red. The security audit she had triggered at 4 a.m. had frozen every executive account. I've been ready for 30 years, Emily, Maria replied, her voice as cold as the morning mist. I just didn't know it until last night. They didn't use the front door. Maria used her biometric override at the side entrance. The one Thomas assumed he had deactivated. But Emily had rerouted the security permissions through a local bypass hours ago. As they entered the grand foyer, the smell of expensive scotch and Vanessa's sharp perfume hung heavy in the air. Thomas was in the dining room. He was still in his gala suit, though his tie was loosened. He was sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, laughing as Vanessa poured him a drink. Jason, the 30-year-old secret, was lounging in a chair nearby, staring at a laptop. They looked like they were celebrating the first day of a new dynasty. The laughter stopped abruptly the moment Maria walked in. Thomas didn't stand up. He leaned back, a smirk spreading across his face. "Maria, you're late. I believe I told you to have your things moved by 8 a.m. It's nearly 9. I've already contacted the movers to handle the leftovers." Vanessa leaned against the table, her eyes mocking. "Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Maria. You had a good run as the guest. Now the adults have business to attend to." Maria didn't look at Vanessa. She walked directly to the table and placed a thick blue folder in front of Thomas. "You're right about one thing, Thomas. This is a day for business." Thomas glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. "What is this? An appeal for a better settlement? I told you, the papers you signed last month are final. You liquidated your claims to Harrington Global and this estate. It's all been moved to the trust." "Open it, Thomas," Martin Reynolds said, stepping forward. "As your former counsel and Maria's current representative, I suggest you read the first page very carefully." Thomas frowned, his arrogance flickering for the first time. He flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the document, and slowly, the color drained from his face. "An emergency injunction?" Thomas whispered. "On what grounds?" "Matrimonial fraud, asset hiding, and industrial espionage," Martin stated. "But more importantly, a breach of the multi-factor identity protocol at Harrington Global. We have digital evidence that you forced through asset transfers using Maria's credentials without her biometric pulse rhythm verification. In this state, that renders the documents you made her sign not just void, but evidence of a felony." Jason stood up, his face reddening. "That's impossible. Apex Neural is a private entity. You can't touch it." "I don't need to touch it, Jason," Emily said, turning her tablet toward him. "I've already traced the seed capital. Every dollar used to start Apex was pulled from a joint account that was supposed to be Maria's personal inheritance from her father. Thomas didn't transfer his assets to you. He stole hers." The room went deathly quiet. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to roar in the silence. "You think you're clever, Maria," Thomas spat, standing up and slamming his hands on the table. "You think a few lines of code and an old lawyer can stop me? I am the chairman of the board. I have the votes. By the time this hits a courtroom, Apex will be a global standard and Harrington will be a memory. I'll buy the judge. I'll buy the whole damn city." "You don't have the votes, Thomas," Maria said quietly. "And you aren't the chairman anymore." Thomas laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "I own 40% of the shares, Maria. Plus the trust's 10%. I am the majority. The security audit Emily triggered this morning found the biometric mismatch in your administrative override," Maria explained, her voice gaining strength with every word. "The board's Ethics and Security Committee was alerted at 5 a.m. They held an emergency virtual meeting an hour ago. Because you used company resources to facilitate a personal fraud, they have exercised the moral turpitude clause in your contract." She leaned in, her face inches from his. "Your voting rights have been suspended pending a criminal investigation. And as the co-founder with the next largest block of original shares you thought I had signed away, I have been appointed acting interim chair." Vanessa stepped forward, her voice trembling with rage. "You can't do this. We have a son. Jason is the future." Maria finally looked at Vanessa. "Jason is a 30-year-old man who allowed his father to steal from his mother's daughter. He isn't a visionary, he's an accomplice. And as for the future? Your future is currently being packed into those suitcases Emily brought for you." Thomas looked at the monitors Jason was using. "The servers, they're locked. Jason, get back in." "I can't, Dad," Jason said, his voice cracking. "The whole Apex core is being audited. It says access denied. Intellectual property dispute." That's because the base logic of Apex Neural belongs to me, Maria said, her eyes flashing with triumph. I recognize my own optimization model, Thomas. I let you think I was just a guest in your world while I continued to build mine in the shadows. I posted that code to the forums to see if you would take the bait. I wanted to see how far you would go to betray me. She straightened her jacket. You went further than I ever imagined. You didn't just take the money, you tried to take my mind. Thomas collapsed back into his chair. The man who had been the king of the Hallbrook Gala just hours ago now looked small, withered, and defeated. Vanessa hovered behind him, her hand clutching his shoulder not in affection, but in a desperate attempt to stay anchored to a sinking ship. Martin, Maria said, not looking back. The police and the forensic auditors are at the gate. Please let them in. As Maria walked toward the foyer, she stopped by the dining room door. She looked at the woman who had spent 30 years helping Thomas build a lie, and the son who was built on that lie. Thomas told the Gala last night that the past is a stagnant pool, Maria said. He was right. And it's time for a clean break. You have 10 minutes to take what you can carry. After that, you can wait for your lawyers on the sidewalk. She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels echoing through the marble halls. No longer the sound of a guest, but the sound of the owner coming home. Emily walked beside her, her tablet still glowing with the data that had brought down an empire. Outside, the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, illuminating a world that Maria Vance was ready to see clearly for the very first time. The high-gloss dream Thomas Vance had unveiled at the Gala was not just cracking. It was undergoing a complete system failure. In the grand dining room of the Vance estate, the air felt heavy with the scent of ozone and desperation. Thomas sat frozen at the head of the table, his charcoal suit, the one he thought signaled the start of a new dynasty, now looking like a shroud. Vanessa hovered behind him, her hands trembling so violently that the ice in her scotch glass rattled like a death knell. Jason, the 30-year-old secret who was supposed to be the future, stared at his laptop screen as if he could force the lines of code to obey him through sheer will. It's not just the accounts, Jason whispered, his voice cracking with a sudden boyish terror. The entire server architecture is rejecting my credentials. It's like the system has rewritten itself around me. Maria Vance stood near the doorway, her charcoal suit a sharp contrast to the chaotic opulence of the room. She watched them with a clinical detachment she hadn't felt in decades. For 40 years, she had played the role of the supportive wife, the silent partner, the guest in Thomas's life. But as she looked at the man who had tried to delete her from the history of his success, she realized that she was the only one in the room who actually understood the language the world was now speaking. It didn't rewrite itself, Jason, Maria said, her voice steady and echoing in the high-ceilinged room. It simply returned to its original intent. You were trying to build your company on a foundation of stolen logic. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own neural optimization model? I was writing code when your father was still trying to figure out how to turn on a monitor. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a wild, cornered rage. You think this is over because of a digital glitch? I built this. Every brick of this house, every share of Harrington Global, belongs to me. I have the paperwork, Maria. You signed it. I signed documents that were obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation, Maria replied, stepping closer to the table. Documents that you processed through an unpatched legacy server to bypass the security protocols Emily helped design. You didn't just lie to me, Thomas. You lied to the board. You lied to the investors. You lied to the law. Martin Reynolds stepped forward, placing a handheld scanner on the table. The forensic auditors are already working with the state police at your downtown offices, Thomas. They've already recovered the metadata from the estate planning session. The system recorded your administrative override. It recorded the fact that you forced Maria's signature through without biometric pulse rhythm verification. In this state, that is not a business maneuver. It is a felony. Vanessa let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. You're all bluffing. Thomas is a billionaire. He owns this city. He owned the image of a billionaire, Emily said, turning her tablet toward Vanessa. The screen displayed a series of real-time financial alerts. But look at the market. The moment the security audit triggered the freeze on the C-suite accounts, The rumors hit the wires. Harrington Global's stock is in freefall. The board has already issued a public statement distancing themselves from you, Dad. They've invoked the moral turpitude clause. You aren't just losing the money, you're losing the shield. The reality finally seemed to settle on Thomas. His shoulders slumped, the arrogance draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. He looked around the room, at the mahogany table, the crystal glasses, the limestone walls, and realized that none of it was his anymore. It was all tied to the name he had tried to discard. What do you want, Maria? Thomas asked, his voice a hollow rasp. You want a bigger settlement? You want the house? Fine. Take it. Just call off the auditors. Tell the board it was a misunderstanding. Maria looked at him with a mix of pity and profound disappointment. You still don't understand, do you? You called me a guest last night. You told the world I was a liability to be liquidated. You tried to fund your secret son's future with my life's work. There is no calling it off. The system doesn't have a misunderstanding function, Thomas. It only has truth and lies. And you've been living a lie for 30 years. She walked to the large bay window that looked out over the sprawling gardens. In the distance, she could see the flashing lights of the security vehicles and the quiet, professional movements of the men in suits who were coming to reclaim the kingdom. I didn't do this for revenge, Thomas, Maria said, her back to him. I did this for accuracy. For 40 years, the record showed you as the sole architect of this empire. Last night, you tried to erase the only other person who knew the truth. All I did was restore the original data. A heavy silence followed. Jason closed his laptop with a sharp snap, his face pale and eyes darting toward the exit. Vanessa began to sob, a low, keening sound that filled the foyer. Thomas just stared at the blue folder Martin had placed on the table, the legal reality of his ruin finally sinking in. The police are at the front door, Martin announced, checked his watch. They have a warrant for the seizure of all electronic devices, and a temporary custody order for the primary residence. Maria has graciously allowed you 10 minutes to gather your personal effects. Anything left behind will be handled by the court-appointed receivers. Maria turned around. She looked at her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and the man who had betrayed her in the most fundamental way. She didn't feel the triumph she had expected. She felt a strange, quiet freedom. You told me the past is a stagnant pool, Maria said, walking toward the dining room door. But you forgot that without the past, you have no anchor. You thought you could float away into a new life with Vanessa and Jason, leaving me on the shore. But you forgot that I'm the one who designed the anchor. She stopped at the threshold and looked at Jason. I hope you actually learned something from my code, Jason. Because it's the only thing of value you're taking with you today. And even then, you don't have the license to use it. Maria walked out of the room, followed by Emily and Martin. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was no longer the rhythmic ticking of a clock waiting for a disaster. It was the sound of a woman walking into the light of her own future. Behind them, the dining room erupted into a chaos of accusations and desperate phone calls. Thomas Vance, the man who had tried to build a dynasty on a foundation of fraud, was left in the wreckage of his own ambition. As Maria reached the foyer, she saw the heavy front doors swing open. The sunlight flooded in, bright and unforgiving, as the auditors and officers stepped inside. For the first time in 40 years, Maria Vance didn't need to ask where to stand. She was exactly where she belonged. At the center of her own life, watching the lies finally dissolve into the morning air. The anniversary trap had closed. Jason looked up from his phone, his face pale. They've frozen the Apex Neural accounts, Dad. Even my personal ones. They said the seed capital was proceeds of a crime. Thomas didn't answer. He looked past Maria toward the house, perhaps looking for a ghost of the life he had just liquidated. But there was no one there but the auditors. Maria turned away from them, her heels clicking purposefully as she walked back toward the car where Emily and Martin were waiting. She didn't look back. The past was no longer a stagnant pool. It was a closed book. A few hours later, Maria and Emily sat in the quiet luxury of a private airport lounge. The sun was high in the sky now, washing the room in a warm, golden light that made the silver at Maria's temples gleam. She had changed out of her business suit and into a comfortable, travel-ready wrap dress of a vibrant, deep emerald green. Emily was typing away on her laptop, but she looked relaxed, a hint of a smile on her face. The security audit is complete, Mom. The board has officially ratified your position as interim chair. The stock is already starting to stabilize now that they know the founder's logic is back in control. Maria took a sip of her tea, looking out at the runway where a sleek jet was being fueled. I don't want to be the chair for long, Emily. I want to find someone who actually cares about the ethics of tech to take over. I've spent 40 years building Thomas's dream. I think it's time I started building mine. Emily closed her laptop and reached across the table to squeeze her mother's hand. We've got time, Mom. All the time in the world. And we've got the resources to do whatever we want. Maria looked at her daughter, the brilliant, fierce woman who had saved her from a landslide of humiliation. You know, Daniel Harrington told me last night that I was just a guest. But as we were leaving the estate, I realized he was wrong about the role, but right about the feeling. For 40 years, I was a guest in my own life. I was always accommodating, always adjusting, always making sure someone else was comfortable. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the lounge window. She didn't see a discarded wife or an aging socialite. She saw a woman who had finally remembered who she was before the world told her who she should be. But guests eventually leave, Maria said with a soft, genuine laugh. And I've finally checked out of Thomas Vance's reality. The PA system announced their flight. Maria stood up, her posture straight, her movements fluid and confident. She didn't need to stay near the bar. She didn't need to worry about being awkward. She didn't even need the Vance name to feel powerful. As they walked toward the gate, Maria felt the small silver bracelet on her wrist. It was a modest thing, but it was real. Just like the love between her and Emily. Just like the justice Martin had helped her secure. The story of Maria and Thomas Vance had ended in fire at the Holbrook Grand Hotel. But as the jet lifted off the runway, climbing high above the city and the small, broken people standing on the sidewalk below, Maria knew that her own story was only just beginning. She was flying toward a world where she wouldn't be a guest, but the author of her own destiny. And for the first time in 40 years, the sky looked completely, beautifully clear.